Welcome to the First Church in Chestnut Hill and to our Sunday sermon for March 13th, 2022. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. The reading for today is strange. It is a portion of chapter 15 from the book of Genesis, and it describes a conversation between God and Abram, eventually the man called Abraham. Abram is worried that he will die without an heir and that all he possesses will pass on to his next of kin, Eliezer of Damascus. There are various reasons for this sense of fear. One, Abraham's line might die out, which is a great concern in those ancient times. And two, there would be no one left to care for Abram's wife Sarai, later Sarah, if Abram dies first. We then hear God reassure Abram that he will have a son and that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. God is seeking to address this fear. But we don't stop there in the story. God then promises Abram land. Intrigued by this promise, Abram presses God to explain exactly what he will possess. God asks Abram to bring some animals to be sacrificed, and then there is this elaborate ritual of animals being cut in half and a pair of lights going back and forth between them, which is kind of weird. But this would have been a far more common sense ritual to ancient Hebrews. The traditional way that one would mark the making of a binding agreement with someone was through a similar animal sacrifice. An animal would be cut in two, and then the parties would walk between the pieces. The implicit idea is that if either side failed to live up to the agreement, that would happen to them, just like to the animal. This imagery is important because this is a moment of creation of a covenant between God and Abram. There would be far more detail on this in the coming chapters, but we begin here. There is also a moment when Abram falls asleep and has a nightmare. As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and a deep and terrifying darkness descended upon him. We are not supplied with the details in this particular moment of why Abram should be so fearful, so I will add those in. God explained that Abram's descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years, but God would then release them and punish those who enslaved them. This is a strange and troubling bit of news for Abram. All we hear about in the sort of pinpoint reading that we are given is that God will give him the land, the promised land. We are not offered the additional portion that explains Abram's fears. We might describe that as an editorial shortcoming of those who would put together the lectionary readings for this morning. Not me, by the way. I don't do that. And I'm guessing that they did not want to get into all the whole Exodus story that might detract from the themes of Lent, themes of promises made and promises kept. But still, if we only hear that part, we are left to puzzle it out. And when you don't have an answer to an obvious question, you might go away troubled. You might not know what to expect, and because of uncertainty, you might become concerned. You might even become afraid, like Abram. I don't know if many of us would get worked up over the outcome of this ancient story, but we can, I hope, place ourselves in Abraham's spot. We can imagine worrying about those we care about our children, our grandchildren, our family and friends, our beloved near and far. How would we respond to such fears that are waiting for us out there in the future? Well, that will depend, of course, on the person and the situation, I imagine. Some will fret about their worries. Some will head out looking for answers, for information, for some measure of clarity. Some people will try to calm their anxious minds with those questions and tasks that all seem to be a little bit more in their control. Because the feeling of not being in control, that is another source of fear. Excuse me. Well, today I want to talk about courage, the virtue of courage. And in the moral realm of virtues, courage is unique. It is the only virtue that is entirely reactive. We can hold our faith dearly, regardless of the circumstances. We can hope warmly in our hearts in good times as well as bad ones. We can be prudent, we can be temperate, we can be just in our lives on an ongoing basis. And of course, we can and should always be out there loving one another. But when are we brave? When are we courageous? We are brave and courageous in response to something or to someone that we fear. Whether it's life's difficulties or we are somehow in the valley of the shadow of death, we are in fear of something. Courage is therefore a situational virtue. And courage lies somewhere on a spectrum of responses. On the lowest end of it, we can find cowardice, where there is no element of courage stirring our hearts into action. And on the high end, there is recklessness, where the virtues of prudence and temperance have fled the scene as moderating influences, and we are just pursuing danger for its own sake. Somewhere in between those two endpoints stands the golden mean of courage. Now, Aristotle defined courage as a virtue that predisposes a person to meet danger. Courage is therefore the ability to confront danger or fear, future pain or present intimidation. It is the capacity to face uncertainty, to step out by necessity onto the ice of the unknown. And I say necessity because, again, courage should not be conflated with foolishness. A needless act could be any number of things, but it is not courageous. And that is one way in which my definition of courage might differ from others. The common usage of the term includes things like physical bravery, such as, skydiving. And bravery of the body is possible, but these examples are not instances of courageousness of the soul. In a voluntary sense of taking risk, courage is often a heady mixture of skill, luck, and pride. Yet this type of bravery does not always migrate into other parts of people's lives. A teenager perfectly willing to careen over concrete and asphalt on a skateboard might never think to stand up against peer pressure. Courage is, again, situational. And we face danger in different ways, but whether that response is courageous depends upon the motivation behind the next step. Acting out of ignorance may appear to be brave, but it might also really be foolish. And there is no great virtue in placing yourself needlessly in harm's way. I recall a few years ago a hiker who went up into the White Mountains of New Hampshire with nothing but the clothes on his back and a cell phone. Now, that man got lost and needed to be rescued. And the hiker risked not only his own life, but the lives of the volunteers who heroically went out to find him. He thought he could just bail himself out with a quick call to the park rangers. And there's nothing brave about such a trip into the mountains. There's nothing virtuous about it. Conversely, the volunteers and the park rangers showed great courage in risking their lives to help someone, even if that person was recklessly pursuing danger in their own life. The volunteers are courageous because they are facing danger, and they are virtuous because they are helping someone. During the early years of World War II, the German army began to cut through the small countries of Western Europe to attack the more strategic countries of France and Norway. In 1940, the Germans attacked the small nation of Denmark. The Danish army could not long stand against the German war machine, so the Danes quickly submitted to the invasion, and their country was occupied. This was not the classic picture of bravery, but the Danes really had no chance against the Germans, and their response was understandable. In hindsight, it seems pretty wise, but their time for bravery, that would come later. The Germans methodically took control of the conquered land and its people. The Danes were again unique in that because they had submitted to Nazi control, they were treated better than other countries. The Danes, however, were not complacent in this occupation. Their resistance grew and through both armed responses and general disobedience. But what is more interesting is that most Danes simply ignored the Germans. Imagine the picture of walking past Nazi stormtroopers as if they were not there. The Danish king, King Christian X, became a symbol of open resistance to the Nazis, riding his horse through the streets of Copenhagen, unarmed and unguarded. And critically, he was an outspoken protector of the Jews of Denmark. The Nazis were, of course, obsessed with a hatred of Jews. Millions were deported from occupied France and Hungary to deadly concentration camps. Yet the Danish government simply refused to cooperate with the Germans on this subject at all. When asked by his German counterpart about, the Jews in Denmark, the Danish foreign minister explained, there is no Jewish question in Denmark. The Danes did not capitulate to Nazi anti-Semitism, and the Danish Jews remained safe through much of the war. But after some frustration on this issue, the Germans decided towards the end of the war in 1943 that it was time to round up the Jews of Denmark. An order authorizing the deportation of the Jews to concentration camps was signed by Hitler himself and was scheduled to begin on October 1st, which was the start of the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah. However, things did not go to Nazi plan. The Danes hid the Jews of their country in their homes, on their farms, in their basements. Copies of the Torah, the Jewish Holy Scriptures, were hidden in the crypt of Trinity Church in Copenhagen. The hospitals used their ambulances to ferry Jews to the coast so that every available boat could secretly carry them over as refugees across the straits to safety in neutral Sweden. More than 7,000 people reached safety in that October flight, 90% of the Danish population of Jews. Only 481 Jews were captured by the Nazis, but under local pressure, they were kept in Denmark, not sent off to the harsh and often inevitably deadly camps in Germany or Poland. The Danish government closely monitored the treatment of the Jewish citizens of Denmark, and they demanded inspections by the Red Cross. The Danish people sent hundreds of care packages to the camp. Most Danish Jews lived to see the end of the war. And they returned to their homes to find that their neighbors had taken care of their houses, their gardens, and even their pets. Not only did the Jews of Denmark survive, but so did their community. And they did so because of the courage of the people of Denmark. Thinking back to that moment, what might any of us have done? The Danes were placing themselves in harm's way to help others. It was not a theoretical form of danger, and yet they acted together and they helped a great many people. Abram, our protagonist this morning, was faced with his own existential fear, not for himself, but for those who would come after him, his children, his grandchildren, his descendants. But what could he do about it? What could he do about protecting those who would come after him and long after him? And we might further ask, why did God tell him any of this? What could Abram do? Well, he could help get them ready. He could plan for the future. He could tell stories and teach lessons that would survive across the ages, much like those set out in the Bible. He could take those steps which were in his immediate control to influence the outcome towards the better. It would be a different form of courage, of responding to the potentially unknown risks of the future by somehow fumbling his way through them in the present. That is something that the current generation can do for those that follow. How might anything like this apply to any of us now? I think about the world at present, with war in Europe, with a pandemic hopefully receding, with distrust and polarization abounding in our own nation, finding it in the hallways of government, in our families even. And a world that is changing around us all the while. A world of weird weather and rapid social change and technological upheaval. What would be the courageous thing for any of us to do in response to any of that? Well, the simple definition of courage is the ability to do something that frightens us. And there are things which are fear-inducing going on all around us. What would the courageous response be? We might think about courage in those larger-than-life ways and moments. Courage on the battlefield, courage fighting wildfires, or rescuing people from, storms or being lost in the mountains. All of those are examples of courage. In those situations, the soldiers and the first responders, they don't lose their fear, but they are able to confront them. They are able to act in spite of them. And if I add one more element, they are acting in spite of their fears for a good purpose. Because this is the virtue of courage we're talking about, and virtue leads us towards the good, which ultimately leads us towards God. As we might glean from the daily news, there is nothing terribly courageous about an invader. There is nothing courageous about a conquering soldier. There is nothing courageous about hurting people in order to achieve some ideological purpose. Courage as a virtue, as a moral value, must always be in service to the good and in service of God. And what each of us fears is, of course, a personal reflection of the world, on our lives. But if we are to act with courage for a greater purpose, then the list of what we might fear probably looks quite a bit different than the things that are keeping us up on any particular night. For example, I've heard it said more than once that it's terrible to imagine the changes that are happening around us in our environment, to our climate. But really, what can any one of us do about it? And besides, it is often added, I will not be around then. I will not be around then. And the unspoken addition I make in my head to that personal lamentation is, well, since I won't be affected, it's not really my problem. Not my problem. But, you might say, what can any one of us really do? One person against all these choices being made in the world. I can't change the world. And that is true. I can't change the world, you can't change the world, but we might be able to change the world. Because honestly, it is impossible for one person to change the world. You might think, that can't be right. People change the world all the time. You might be thinking there are special people who have changed the world, heroic people, brilliant people, influential people, and you might think that. But it's not really true. They did not change the world. The people who listened to them changed the world. The people who followed their advice or their example, they changed the world. The people who stood up to the challenge because someone had already stood up in a moment of bravery. Winston Churchill didn't defeat the Nazis personally, but he was an example for those who gathered to do so. George Washington did not personally create the United States, but he rose up as an example for the people who were working towards a common and cherished goal. Martin Luther King Jr. did not on his own bring about modern civil rights, but his leadership within the civil rights movement helped to bring about those changes in others. Courage is about stepping up. One person can start that process so that the first and brave, lonely souls, those people are very important. And then the next part is just as important. More people need to act bravely, to choose better. No, there's nothing brave about driving a Prius, no offense to any of you that drive a Prius, but it is brave to make changes to our lives that help the next generation potentially live better ones, even if those changes are expensive or bothersome or difficult. It is brave to speak up for people, especially when those people are not in the room. When somebody says something inappropriate about someone's gender, someone's race, someone's religion, the brave thing to do is to say, in that moment, knock it off. Yes, that might be very uncomfortable. It might not make you a very popular person in that moment, but some of the bravest things that any of us can do day to day are those small bits of good against the small bits of bad that we come across. What is the right thing to do? What is the good thing to do or to say or to not do or to not say? Well, as the saying goes, all evil needs to triumph is for good men and women to do nothing. All chaos needs to triumph is for people who care about goodness and order to let things fall apart around them. The people of Denmark opposing the Nazis, they did not start off the war looking like heroes. Their journey towards courage began with the simple notion that the Jews of their country deserved their care and their concern. That began in small ways, and it transformed over time, at least, into a massive rescue effort. Because being courageous begins with that simple decision that there are things in this world that you are willing to stand up for and to stand up against. Courage is such a grand-sounding idea, but it's merely summoning up the ability to act, even when we're afraid or anxious or nervous. It need not be a life or death battle. It can simply be remembering what we believe to be good and right and true, and then doing something about it. Remembering those values and standing up for those values. And that takes more effort, certainly. But if we are to be true to those values that we hold sacred, we must be ready to overcome what fears we have, to lift our voices in defense of that which leads us towards the good and that which ultimately leads us back toward God. Amen.